Welcome to this session on Managing Camper Behavior, Strategies for Counselors, Part 2. Why are we discussing behavior management strategies? Our goals as counselors and staff is to provide a safe environment at camp. And as we know, campers are relentless researchers, meaning they will test the rules, the limits, and maybe even your authority as counselors. Before we begin with strategies, I want to give you a pro tip. When working with campers, and especially when utilizing a behavior management strategy, be aware of the tone of your voice. My pro tip is speak with calm interest. Use a normal voice, neither an apology or an angry voice, and be aware of the tone and the speed of your voice. Hopefully you know when you get excited or angry what happens to your voice, and you can kind of be aware of that. And also, don't use sarcasm. Sarcasm in your tone or your words can often be misunderstood or misinterpreted, especially by a younger camper. In part 1 of this session, I talked about 5 strategies for managing camper behavior. In this session, I'll discuss strategies number 6 through 10. Strategy number 6 is called limited choices. Limiting choices means providing choices which will help guide a camper towards correct behavior. It involves restricting the number of choices. For example, you can choose this or this. So the choices are the limits. The choices that you as a counselor offer kind of define the limits. For example, let's say you've given instructions while teaching a session, a craft session, and you've said the hot glue guns and the glitter can only be used at the table where you've placed them. If a camper attempts to take a glue gun elsewhere, you say, are you going to use the glitter at this table or the glue gun at this table, offering 2 choices only. Campers then make a choice from what you have given. Sometimes you may have a camper that has a great deal of difficulty making decisions, even over simple decisions like in a craft session, for example. This is another time when offering limited choices might help a camper make a choice and move on with the activity. As mentioned earlier, state your choices in a voice with calm interest. The next strategy, number 7, is called positive correction. Corrective statements should be instructive. Campers need guidance on how to behave, not just how not to behave. Use positive words rather than don't or stop or no when you have to provide discipline for campers. A positive correction goes the extra step and teaches a desired behavior rather than just admonishing a mistake. For example, consider the following pairs of statements. Instead of, don't throw your towels on the floor, try, hang your towels on the hooks so they can dry. Or instead of, no moving the chairs, try, when you enter, please sit in the first 2 rows, and please leave the chairs arranged as they are. Next, I want to talk about 2 strategies that you've probably heard of and maybe experienced a time or 2. Number 8 strategy is natural or logical consequences. First, let's take a look at what they are and then when they might be used as a strategy at camp. Natural consequences are when an outcome naturally follows from the camper's action. Logical consequences are an outcome which, while it's contrived or made up, is closely related to the camper's action. Before we go further in discussing natural and logical consequences, let's make clear when not to use natural or logical consequences. You may have even heard that there's sometimes controversy over using this kind of method, but if you're clear about when it's not appropriate, it can be a teaching opportunity. When not to use natural consequences are, of course, when there's a life-threatening consequence, an unhealthy consequence, or a morally questionable consequence. It's unkind, it's unfair, it's hurtful, or it's dishonest. Natural consequences, an outcome naturally follows from the camper's action, And it also provides information that helps that camper make a better choice in the future. Natural consequences may cause frustration, but that is an important part of learning or the learning experience. Here's a couple of examples of natural consequences. The camper chooses the wrong shoes for an activity and therefore their feet hurt. Or the camper refuses to wear a jacket to campfire and therefore they're cold that evening. Or the camper ruins something that they borrowed from somebody and therefore they're no longer able to borrow things from that person or maybe from anybody else in the cabin. Logical consequences are when an outcome, while it's contrived or created, probably by you, is closely related to the camper's action. Here's a few examples of logical consequences. A camper intentionally breaks, notice the word intentional, breaks a piece of sports equipment, and therefore they can't use that equipment anymore, meaning you've enacted a policy that they can't use that equipment anymore. Another example might be the camper throws food in the dining hall. And as a result, a logical consequence would be that they would clean up the food and the table and the floor area that might have become messy because of that action. Another example might be a group of campers make a mess in the restroom, which when they're supposed to be cleaning up, instead they make it messier. And the logical consequence there would be for the group to repeat the task until they've accomplished it in an appropriate way. I'm spending some time discussing natural and logical consequences here because I see this strategy used often at camp, and this can be an effective strategy. Used appropriately, consequences can give a camper information to make better choices in the future. Consequences plus empathy equals learning. What does empathy sound like? Something like, "Sorry you were cold at campfire," said in your calm interest voice, of course, not, "I told you so." To summarize this strategy of utilizing natural and logical consequences, let's consider some guidelines. Consequences should be simple and practical. Sometimes I've seen a counselor create consequences that were actually more trouble for them than they were for the camper, so keep that in mind. Also, avoid consequences that could hurt an entire group if there's really only one camper that should be involved. Avoid consequences that involve withholding food, and I'm not talking about meals here, I'm talking more something like snacks that might be offered in the cabin. Most campers will accept reasonable consequences. Campers understand that there are rules and that the rules are there to keep them safe. So that's another one of the positives about consequences, is that most campers will accept them when they're reasonable. When campers see that what they choose, either good or bad, is directly connected to a consequence, they will make better choices. And notice the emphasis here in both good and bad. Certainly campers make good choices, and you should obviously point out the results of good choices also and the consequences that flow from that. When possible, consequences should be explained ahead of time or as soon as a problem might develop. Usually you would use an if-then statement in this kind of situation. For example, if you choose this, then this is likely to happen. This puts it in kind of a positive stance so that they can make a better choice. Strategy number 9 is the millimeter acknowledgement. Campers are often reluctant to accept any responsibility for poor choices or inappropriate actions. The millimeter acknowledgement allows them to admit just a little bit of responsibility. It uses a bit of humor to break through a defensive stance. I've seen counselors use this strategy really effectively. It works like this. Use your thumb and your index finger to model a very small measure. As you ask a camper, do you think it's remotely possible that you might have done this? Or do you think there's this much of a chance that you might have heard the directions but didn't really respond? Or do you think you could be even a tiny bit nervous about going to outpost camping? These are just examples. Once a child accepts this very small bit of responsibility for their actions or their attitude, a plan can be made to correct the situation or discuss the problem. Again, this requires a bit of skill on the part of the counselor to use that little bit of humor to break through a camper's defense and get them to help kind of be part of the solution for a problem. Strategy number 10 is run the schedule on time. In our camp planning, we spend time finalizing a schedule that will allow just the right amount of time for each activity to get from one activity to the next and to accomplish all the things we want to do during the week of camp. So what does sticking to the schedule have to do with managing camper behavior? As a camp director, I make big and small decisions all day long to keep the schedule moving as planned. Why is this important? Let's look at an example. Session time ends at 11:30. All the tribes are required to reconvene at the rec hall where campers will rejoin their original cabin groups. The tie-dye session, however, is late again. Because of this, 12 cabin groups await their return. Bored campers, frustrated by this delay and waiting, create their own agenda, complete with towel snapping, shoving each other off the benches, and rock throwing. And counselors teaching the tie-dye session are not yet present, so their campers roam about unsupervised during this time. This example illustrates how schedule problems can escalate or cause behavior problems that really wouldn't have existed otherwise. Campers have a responsibility to their campers and to each other to do their part to keep on schedule. This helps avoid unnecessary downtime and the behavior management problems that came along with it. In summary, we've reviewed 5 strategies that you can utilize to manage camper behavior: limited choices, positive corrections, natural or logical consequences, the millimeter acknowledgement, and run the schedule on time. I hope this session has given you several tools to work with your campers in positive ways this summer, even at times when their choices or their behavior might be a bit challenging. Thank you for serving as a counselor, and let's have a great year at camp.